In this video, I want to go over a few tips and tricks that you can use to determine how atoms are connected when drawing a Lewis structure. The first tip would be to use the single atom in the formula as the central atom. When molecules have a formula that look like either one of these two generic formulas, where one atom is a single atom and another atom is a multiple of atoms, like B would be a single atom here and A would be a single atom in this formula. Usually those can be used as the central atoms. An example that uses this formula or this pattern of formula would be water, where it has H2O. The hydrogen, there would be more than one hydrogen, and the oxygen is the single atom. So the oxygen is the central atom. And from there, we can usually connect the atoms together pretty quickly. An atom that uses this format that looks similar to this would be methane, where carbon is the central atom and there's multiple hydrogen atoms. So we know right away the carbon will be the central atom, and from there we can connect the rest of the atoms pretty quickly. When we see a formula like this, we'll know right away that the single atom goes to the center. An example would be the ammonium ion. We know right away that there's a single nitrogen, so that's going to go in the center. And we know that the hydrogens surround the nitrogen. We can usually connect those pretty quick after we find out which atom is the central atom. Another example, SO2. Sulfur is a single atom, so we know right away that that's going to be the central atom. And from there, we can figure out pretty quickly where the rest of the atoms go. The second tip would be to use the honk method. I think it's so simple that it's just really easy to remember, and it works. So we know that hydrogen can only form one bond. Oxygen usually forms two bonds. Nitrogen usually forms three bonds. And carbon usually forms four bonds. Whenever you have a formula, it'll give you a general guideline to put the molecule together. I'm just going to do formaldehyde. So CH2O, so right away we know that carbon's going to have four bonds, hydrogen's going to have one bond, and oxygen's going to have two bonds. And if we look at the actual Lewis structure of formaldehyde, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I just want to point out how really useful this little tip works. So this is a Lewis structure of formaldehyde, and we can see that carbon has four bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can see that the hydrogens have one bond for each hydrogen. This hydrogen has one bond, this hydrogen has one bond. So that checks out. And the oxygen has two bonds, and in this case it's a double bond, but this checks out too. So knowing this, we can write how many bonds each atom has and almost snap them together. So oxygen has two bonds and hydrogen has one bond. So it's going to be like this. Carbon has four bonds, hydrogen has one bond. So molecule is going to look like this. And nitrogen has three bonds, so we know that it's going to look something like this. Actually looks like this. But it's a good guide to use when you come up to the step in the Lewis structure where you have to connect the molecules. A third tip would be to determine what atoms are central atoms and what atoms are terminal atoms. Hydrogen atoms are always terminal atoms because they can only form one bond. And the central atom is usually the atom with the lowest electronegativity. We went over this in a previous video, but I did want to add this to part of the tips to use when you're connecting atoms for a Lewis structure. So using formaldehyde again, carbon has, I think carbon has an electronegativity of 2.5, and oxygen has something like 3. So the lowest electronegativity would obviously be, so that's going to be the central atom. We know that the hydrogens are always terminal atoms, so we can put those here. And the only atom that's left is the oxygen. They're obviously not going to go on the hydrogens, so we can connect that then to the carbon atom, and that would be the skeleton of the Lewis structure. Just to finish this up, the Lewis structure would look like this. And the fourth tip is when molecules are made up of carbon and hydrogen, carbon is usually always the central atom and hydrogen is always the terminal atom. This usually takes place in organic chemistry. An example would be C2H4 ethylene. The carbon atoms are the central atoms, so we have something like this, and then the hydrogens would come off the carbons, and they are the terminal atoms. But usually all atoms that are made up of carbon and hydrogen the carbon is usually always the central atom and hydrogen is always the terminal atom. So in summary, the first tip, use the single atom in a formula as the central atom. The second tip is the HONC method. HONC, H-O-N-C equals 1, 2, 3, 4. And the third tip is to determine what atoms are central and terminal atoms. Hydrogen is always a terminal atom, and the central atom is usually the lowest in electronegativity. And the fourth tip is when molecules are made up of carbon and hydrogen, carbon is usually always the central atom, and hydrogen is always the terminal atom.